now, live from the Daniel Scappin Studio, deep in the foothills of the North Georgia mountains, it's Mike Malloy.
Well, I don't want to offend anybody with the sound of my voice or the fact that I probably belong in some ICU getting oxygen, but I'm going to keep going as long as I can. I still have this horrible upper bronchial situation, but as long as my voice doesn't bother you with the raspy talking inside of a tank sound to it, I shall continue, he said, hopefully. Welcome to the Malloy Podcast. Today is Tuesday, the 21st of March, 2023. My sponsor tonight is an old familiar face, bless his heart. David Burleson is our sponsor tonight, and his message is pretty consistent. David writes, once again, thanks for all you do, and thank you for keeping us truth seekers informed. Dave, thank you very much for your continuing sponsorship. It just absolutely is part of keeping us going. And I might mention, you can contribute to this podcast if you care to by going to MikeMalloy.com. The information is there. There are a number of ways you can do that. And while you're there, you might want to check out River Moon Coffee. There's a link to their website at MikeMalloy.com. I'm holding in my left hand right now a half cup of River Moon Coffee, still hot, which I have been using to try to calm my voice down a little bit. That's another quality of River Moon Coffee that perhaps you don't know about. It's great if you have a upper bronchial infection. I don't know how it's great, but it sure as hell tastes good. River Moon Coffee, my one business sponsor. Check them out, okay? On Sunday, the 19th, it was the 20th year since our invasion of Iraq. Now, this is relevant considering what we are involved in with the Russians and Ukraine. And for a number of years, on the anniversary of that invasion, I would play sound recordings taken by CNN on the night of the invasion, the night that the United States launched so-called shock and awe against the people of Iraq. Now, that entire war, that entire invasion, the deaths of all the people involved, almost 5,000 Americans killed, up to 1 million Iraqis killed. It was all based on lies. I hope you have come to that conclusion now that we're 20 years past that day that the United States committed what the judges at Nuremberg declared to be the worst war crime imaginable, the unprovoked invasion of another country. Now, like so many of our other military interventions, you can think of Vietnam as one. The rationale used for us to invade Iraq was based on a series of lies. Just like former President Lyndon Johnson used the bullshit Tonkin Gulf incident as a pretext to escalate the Vietnam War, in the same way, George W. Bush used this mythical weapons of mass destruction lie and a completely fabricated link between Saddam Hussein and the 9/11 attacks on this country to justify the war crime that this country was about to commit. Who was involved in all this? These names, if you remember, and I was doing radio back at the time this occurred, and it was horrifying to me, horrifying. But Bush, his vice president, the war criminal Dick Cheney, his defense secretary, the war criminal Donald Rumsfeld, his national security advisor, the war criminal Condoleezza Rice. They all falsely conspired and warned that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And it was Condoleezza Rice who invoked this image of, the way she put it, a mushroom cloud, inferring a nuclear bomb, to justify the impending invasion of Iraq. But Secretary of State Colin Powell if ever there was a more criminal, lying presentation to the United Nations than what Colin Powell said, I have no idea what it could have been. Colin Powell presented lies about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction to the UN Security Council about a month before we invaded. And the lies were the sort that the phrase bald-faced lies still applies. And Powell stood there before the UN Security Council, or sat there before the Security Council, and listed a series of lies to justify what we were about to do. In 2002, months before Colin Powell's bullshit presentation to the UN, and the War Crimes Tribunal run by George W. Bush invaded Iraq, the former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter confirmed that Iraq had destroyed 95% of its weaponry, and there was no evidence that he had retained the other 5%, which didn't necessarily constitute a threat or even a weapons program. If you can remember, Saddam Hussein's government stated over and over and over again, and the UN weapons inspectors proved this over and over and over again, that he, Saddam, had no such thing as a program involving the development of weapons of mass destruction. It did not exist. And in fact, none of these so-called weapons were ever found by the UN weapons inspectors before or after Bush's invasion of Iraq. What was the bullshit that was put out back then? Do you remember? Well, it was buried in the desert. Well, it was moved to Iran. Well, the Russians hid it. And in addition, Bush came up with a whole bunch of lies connecting Iraq and Al-Qaeda, even though intelligence put together by our own intelligence agencies proved that to be bullshit. This is the same way that Donald Trump refused to listen to our intelligence officers who were trying to tell the Trump administration that, yes, the Russians had influenced his victory in this country. Bush, Trump, cut from the same cloth. Then you have the Downing Street minutes. Do you remember that? Until I read Marjorie Cohen's piece, I'd completely forgotten it. That was a transcript of one of Prime Minister Tony Blair's briefings with British intelligence, published by the Times of London in 2005. And it demonstrated, the Downing Street minutes demonstrated that the Bush administration had decided by July of 2002 to invade Iraq and bring about regime change. Those so-called Downing Street minutes revealed, quote, intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. In other words, make the decision, we're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and then construct an entire story of bullshit around that end to justify the means by which we were going to do it. And the reality was, of course, that the means and the end were in direct violation of the UN Charter and the agreement to which we affixed our national name at Nuremberg. But to the Bush crime family, that didn't mean anything. And to the American public, it didn't mean anything. Efforts were made to explain to us what was going on, but we chose not to listen to it. And even a congressional report in 2005 in this country that was prepared at the direction of the former Representative John Conyers Jr. That report concluded that in spite of intelligence information to the contrary, members of the Bush administration lied before the invasion about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction and lied about the so-called linkage between al-Qaeda and Iraq. And even though the Bush war criminals pressured the UN Security Council to pass a resolution authorizing the attack on Iraq, the UN Security Council refused. So Bush and his war criminal allies, instead, they put together several prior council resolutions, none of which authorized the invasion of Iraq, and they used that as a pretext to invade this country. And Bush justified the attack with something that he called his doctrine of, quote, preemptive war, end quote. Preemptive war. But the UN Charter only allows a country to use military force in response to an armed attack by another country, or with permission, like I mentioned, from the Security Council. And again, by definition, Operation Iraqi Freedom violated the UN Charter and was in fact an illegal war of aggression. Doesn't this sound familiar? Isn't this what the bastard Vladimir Putin has now been labeled a war criminal and an arrest warrant issued for him a year after his invasion of Ukraine? It's 20 years after our invasion of Iraq. Has there been a similar action taken against the people who led this country into criminal activity? No, of course not. Now, the U.S. forces, and again, we're going to use definitions put together by this country and the Allies after World War II. Our forces committed a bunch of other war crimes in Iraq, including extrajudicial killings, torture, the targeting of civilians. All of this is prohibited by the Geneva Conventions. It's prohibited by the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. And it's prohibited by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Remember Abu Ghraib? Remember the pictures? Remember pictures of Iraqi civilians being executed because the United States considered them to be operatives of Saddam Hussein? How in the hell can we forget this stuff? Torture and abuse that was conducted at Abu Ghraib prison. Remember the pictures of stacked naked prisoners on top of one another, photographing prisoners who had been forcibly arranged in sexually explicit positions. Remember when it was revealed that we kept prisoners naked for days, when we forced male prisoners to wear women's underwear, when we used snarling dogs, when we punched, slapped, and kicked prisoners, and sodomized a prisoner with a chemical light and a broomstick. Jesus Christ. And civilians were targeted when U.S. troops operated under rules of engagement that directed them to shoot everything that moved in so-called free fire zones. Remember that? We also bombed civilian areas. We used cluster bombs. We used depleted uranium. We used white phosphorus, which resulted in massive civilian death and injury. We did this.
Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.